We're not going to be, well, actually, this may turn into a podcast. You just never know, really. Just trying to go live. Just a tickety boom here. I'll figure that out in a second. Let's have a look in the back end. That's all good. That should be fine. We've had a few technical errors this afternoon. So me and Mitton have already had a bit of a time. Originally, I was going to be doing the stuff behind the bar because it's beautiful and I wanted a different view than this all the time. But now it turns out that I'm going to have to be sitting at my desk on my computer. Dave is a really old friend of mine. We met when we were both much skinnier than we are now. And I think that's our benchmark is gray hair, beard, and weight. Is how long you've been friends with people when you've been in the industry this long. But I want to welcome Dave. Thanks very much for joining me, man.
Good to be here. Good to see you and hear you. It's fantastic. No technical difficulties.
No technical difficulties. There was a little touch and go there for a second. I was like, this can't be the first time. This can't be the first time and be completely screwed up. So what I kind of wanted to do with this is that a lot of times when I'm doing these sort of episodes and videos and stuff, it's all about business and entrepreneurship and stuff. And to be honest, it's Friday afternoon. I just wanted to relax. It's the end of I won't say dry January, a drier January. There can never be a dry January. So really, I wanted to interview you, which I've done a number of times already, but I think there's a lot of people out there that are going to be like, oh, who's this dude? And actually today I was on Clubhouse, which is a new social media platform that's sort of like, remember the old school like AOL forums you used to go into and everybody would be in the chat room talking via like keyboards? Now it's like chat rooms, but all audio. So you can go in there and chat. And I was talking to a bunch of whiskey people today about Canadian whiskey and its underratedness and today's little episode.
There you go. Hopefully some of them will tune in.
Well, they said they were going to try to. So I'm pretty stoked that they're at least going to try. John Paletti. Oh, he's from Australia. Jeez. Hey, buddy. How are you? So I want to kick it off with a quick origin story from you, because the thing with Canadian whiskey, and I think we've talked about this a couple of times, is like when I think both of us were getting into Canadian whiskey in a big way, it was still looked at as like this huge underdog like whiskey category. I think it still is to a degree, but like when you were getting into it, like nobody was using Canadian whiskey in cocktails. Like, let's be really honest, like you fell in love with the category, but nobody was really going crazy at using it in cocktails.
No, absolutely. I mean, from the bars and restaurants that I had where you and I first met, like I certainly wanted to be a patriot and use Canadian whiskey in cocktails. And, you know, I used American whiskey, all kinds of different American whiskeys, Scotch, Irish, Japanese was coming into play back then, but you were kind of limited, and you remember that. Like, I can think of all of us talking about it. Like, no matter what brand of Canadian whiskey it was back in the late 90s, early 2000s, for the most part, it was that soft double column distilled corn with like a pinch of rye. So you weren't getting much different expressions from brand to brand or even within the brands. So, I mean, you were limited to what you could do. Big vermouths and herbal liqueurs would generally overpower it when you would use it in cocktails. Sure, you could do a Manhattan or an old fashioned, but might not pack as much of a punch, might be softer. And it was, I think, like when I really started getting excited was when Lot 40 was reintroduced in 2012. And I just was like, what is this? And like, and at that point in my life, I was understanding, like, when I liked bourbons, I liked higher rye bourbons. And I didn't even realize at this time, but I'm a guy who likes rye. So I fell in love with Lot 40, and, kind of the rest is history. Of used it for several years, and eventually the company came to me and didn't ask if I wanted to be part of it, but I wanted to know if I wanted to start talking about it around the world. And I was thinking of it yesterday. It's going to be 7 years this June.
Wow.
7 years.
You're going to start getting... You're still going to get starting in the conversations when people talk about Angus Winchester and Raj Nagar and
I doubt I'll ever be in the same conversation compared to those gentlemen. But yeah, I mean, I just think I'm like, oh, I've been doing this a couple of years and sold the restaurant a couple of years ago, but it's like, no, sold the restaurants 4 years ago, been doing this full time for 7 years this June. Like, it's crazy to think that.
What keeps your passion going for it? Like, there's a lot to be said. Like, I think a lot of people get into brand ambassadorship because the brand comes along and is like, oh, you'd be really cool for our brand, come on board. But how do you personally keep really feeling like, I can't see you as a brand ambassador for anything else? Like, to me, you're Canadian whiskey in my head, like up there with like Davin and Chris and Dr. Don and stuff like that. Like, you're Canadian whiskey. Kind of like Donnie. Donnie is rum, you know?
Yeah. I mean, yes. And again, thank you for putting me on the same sentence as people like Davin and Don. But I mean, those guys have been doing this much longer than me. And I mean, I think I reached a different audience. And I agree with you. I think I've painted myself into a corner. It's, you know, Canadian whiskey. And even so, the brands I look after, I mean, the passion, you said it earlier, it's still, I think, the world's most misunderstood spirit. It's the underdog. It's a really interesting whiskey category. Like, if you look at the U.S., the United States of America drinks 24.1 million cases of Canadian whiskey every year. Think about that.
But how?
Like, that's a lot. But yet, if you go to the U.S., no one really knows anything about Canadian whiskey. Anywhere you go, when I'm in Europe or UK, it's so unknown that a lot of people don't even realize we've been a category for a long time. Like, when I explain that one of our brands has been produced since 1832 is the first time it came out, it blows people's minds. Like, what are you talking about? I'm like, yeah, Canadian whiskey's peak was the mid 1800s. Like, we were making it before then. It's just, we're kind of in the last half a decade or maybe even decade, we're really starting to get a little more notice. And it is a small scale. People are paying a little more attention to it, which is great. And, you know, with that, it's just that old saying in sales, is like getting liquid to lips. Like, I'm very confident anytime I take people through a tasting, it's pretty rare that people don't walk out loving one of them at least. And,
Yeah.
you know, it's where there's someone likes a big rye or a softer corn or a more complex 4-grain blend. Because there's so much innovation happening, and that's what keeps me going. It's like the passion of educating people. It's a big world. We got a lot of people to educate. And, you know, there's going to be a lot of amazing things coming from the category, not just from us, from so many other brands and distilleries around Canada. I'm excited to see what the next decade brings.
Yeah, it's been interesting. I've been dabbling a little bit in TikTok lately, and I did an old-fashioned video. Oh yeah, no dances, no comedy, nothing like that. Just straight up cocktails. But I did an old-fashioned video, and the whole state of Wisconsin hated me. Like, the whole state of Wisconsin hated my guts for that video because it wasn't a Wisconsin old-fashioned. The state of Wisconsin has their own dedicated old-fashioned, which is muddled fruit brandy topped with like a flavored soda. Whether if it's sweet, it's like Sprite or 7-Up. If it's sour, it's Jolly Bee sour grapefruit soda. Very weird. Like, it was mental. And then I did a Wisconsin old-fashioned, but it shows how, like, people talk about brandy in the same sort of way in the US. Like, people go, oh, the US doesn't drink any brandy, but then the whole state of Wisconsin just drinks brandy. And then you talk about Georgia and Texas and stuff like that. So you start talking about people outside the regions that sell a ton of Canadian whiskey. Even today, when I was talking to these guys on Clubhouse, when I mentioned Canadian whiskey, you could hear because they're all bourbon nerds and like those things. Are like, whoa. I'm like, Canadian whiskey is like, if you use the rules for good and not evil, you can create some really fantastic whiskeys. And they're like, okay, we'll tune in. So I want to taste something, and then we can get into the production, because what are we tasting first?
Let's kind of go. I mean, we've got some crazy expressions starting tonight. Let's go. I mean, let's start with lightest, softest, more traditional style. JP Weiser's 15. Talking with the crew.
I wasn't expecting this one to be the first at all.
Well, I mean, we're certainly not going lightest to heaviest tonight. I think we'll kind of go simpler to more complex. Like even talking to the crew, Colin Dougal, who you know is the ambassador out west, or product consultant, I should say, looks after our range of Canadian West Coast. He was mentioning yesterday, talking about it, how he was really trying to get some people into this. And I'm like, you know what? I never speak about JP Weiser's 15, and it's a fun whiskey. It's something that, you know, you know me, I'm really honest when talking about the category and brands and how market whiskey making comes together. Like, this certainly was one of our brands that, you know, it was created to be a little more of a traditional style but luxury expression of Canadian whiskey. So the majority of this is that soft double column distilled corn. It's got a touch of that once column distilled rye. It is aged in 3 different casks. So you've got the New American Oak, which brings on all the warming vanilla, toffee and caramel, sweet notes. You've got ex-Canadian whiskey casks, which usually emphasizes grain and yeast characteristics. And then you've got ex-bourbon casks, which usually brings on dried fruit notes. So this is a little more complex blend. And I'm gonna play a game with you now. This is one of the few expressions that we use the 9.09 rule.
Okay. Well,
we don't use that rule in many of our expressions. So I wanted to see what you smell on this, if you nose or taste anything in particular.
Well, let's go back to that. For the people who are watching who may not be Canadian whiskey savvy, do you want to give a quick brief overview on like the rules and like I said, use the rules for good and not evil?
Yeah, absolutely. So the 9.09 rule was something that came about in the mid 1800s, where whiskey producers in Canada, they were trying to attract, for instance, cognac or rum drinkers, which, you know, was very expensive spirit to find and not as easy to find at the time. Certainly not in Canada. So they were blending a small amount of cognac or rum into their Canadian whiskey blends. And I mean, it worked. It when the category exploded, essentially what they had to do is they had to set a rule in place. So as it states, for every 100 liters of whiskey produced, you can add a 2-year aged spirit or a wine, up to 10 liters of it to every 100 liters. And I think a lot of Canadian whiskey producers do take advantage of this. A lot don't. Like I say, most of our expressions, we do not. I think it's not for any reason. It's a really fun way to do things. When you're stuck with a spirit, like we did at JP Weiser's Union 52 a couple of years ago, where we had a 52-year-old Scotch, if you remember. And there wasn't enough to go around a bottle, and that's a whole long story, but we were able to put 4% of that 52-year-old Scotch into a 15-year-old corn whiskey, and it was stunning. The Scotch on its own at 52 years, 1 barrel of it, like you weren't going to do anything with that. It was almost unpalatable. But it was Speyside, you put it in the corn, it was stunning. And we couldn't have done that without the 9.09 rule. So you can get really creative with it. Now, I also think, you know, that's the pros to it. The cons to it is there's confusion around that. When people hear, oh, Canadians can blend anything they want into their whiskey. That's not the case. And I couldn't grasp the first few years of doing this, like why people would think that. And then I realized, as I started spending more time in the US and working with American whiskey ambassadors, and Gina Fawcett, who looks after the US for us, she's got a huge background in American whiskeys. And I mean, in America, there's 36 categories of whiskey, and that's not regional. And one of their categories is American blended. And in American blended whiskey, you can add up to 80% neutral grain spirit, vodka, to the whiskey.
That's crazy.
And you know, in Canada and Scotland, you cannot do that. It's illegal. You cannot add a neutral grain spirit or vodka. You cannot add juice. You cannot add sugar. Like, that's illegal. So I think when you're in the American market and Americans hear blended whiskey, they're kind of thinking of their own category with that. So what do you think of this one? Like you say, this is probably one of the lightest.
Yeah, like I think you hit the nail on the head. Like I I never look at this one as like, oh, this should be your welcoming sort of your JP Weiser style. Like 15-year-old, you're like, oh, that's a special occasion whiskey. I'm racking my brains because it's not brandy or cognac because it hasn't got that the aroma and that massive like fruitiness.
It's very soft. I mean, on the nose, you get like the toffee, a little bit of banana bread, some baking spice from the ex-Canadian whiskey cask, and the rye. Subtle hint of green apple, and that's from the older corn whiskey. It's really soft, extremely smooth. Delicate notes of your sweet toffee and English toffee, sweet caramel. You got the warming rye. You've got a lot of mature oak from the Canadian whiskey casks. Little bit of tobacco, I think, and some pecan and dried fruit at the end. And that comes, I think, from the 2% of sherry that we blend into it.
Is it Manzanilla sherry?
I can't answer that for sure. And the reason, you know me, tell everything. If we, for instance, when we barrel finish with certain sherry casks or Speyside whiskey casks, the one information I don't ever get is where it came from, because essentially the easy answer to that rule is we did a Pike Creek Speyside cask a few years back, and I actually know the company it came from, but they won't tell us what was in it before, and we don't have their permission to talk about it, because essentially if you were to put that in a label, that came from that, and then somebody like the it's a whole legal thing where you can't really know the name. But
yeah, I think Michter's does the same thing with their barrels. Like when Michter's sends their barrels away, they like scrub like any mention of them off the thing, so no one can say, oh, finished in Michter's barrels. I do have to go back to that American whiskey thing. It was the one thing on the CSS that absolutely flummoxed me was the American whiskey section, because up here we don't get any of that stuff. We get Canadian Kentucky straight bourbon and like Kentucky straight rye. We don't get a lot of stuff outside like their premium tier. So when I'm starting to read this and doing my test on the CSS, I'm like, I have no idea of these weird categories that I've never tasted. I will never taste unless I go to the US and pick up a bowl of Cougar from the New Orleans liquor store when I'm in New Orleans. Like, you never see these categories in Canada, so it threw me for an absolute loop. But I love my sherry finishes, and now I'm starting to feel you. But I do understand why. Like, I've seen a lot of distilleries not mention where it's coming from. So for the people watching, because I want to really make this sort of like a educational drinking session. All the grains are distilled separately as a brief overview, and then they're all aged separately, which gives a unique perspective on that rule that you were mentioning. But it really does make the blending process the most important part of the whiskey making. Like, we really talk about the grain styles and how they're distilled and that sort of thing. But really, at the end of the day, Dr. Don's job is aggressively difficult overall in comparison.
It's you know, it's not just a cute nickname, Dr. Don. Like, he does have his PhD in brewing and distilling. He's been a microbiologist at the distillery for 25-year anniversary this year, actually. Like you say,
I want to read this.
Sorry, what was that?
Just had some feedback.
Well, we're so far away. Vancouver, Toronto, it's not next door to each other. Or Victoria, pardon me. Yeah, I mean, Hiram Walker, you know this, and anyone tuning in, if you had some American friends that you were talking to this afternoon, it's not a rule or regulation, but generally most Canadian whiskey producers keep all the grains blend bottled. Corn, rye, grain, and wheat. Barley. We buy 100,000 metric tons of corn every year, actually, and probably about 30,000 grain, the rye, wheat, and barley. And each one of those grains, they're fermented separately, they're distilled separately, and in Canadian law, we can distill any way we want. So we call them distill, we double call them distill, we call them in pot distill. You could pot distill. Then they're aged separately. And in Canadian law, it must be aged in a wooden cask under 700 liters. And a 700-liter cask is huge. I mean, we generally age in 250 liter barrels, but we use, like Scotland and Ireland, we use ex-bourbon casks. We use a lot of new American oak. We use a lot of new French oak. Rum, sherry, wine. I mean, Don's got a list of probably 20 different types of casks he's aging in right now, some experiments where it's endless. And then, yeah, we do have a master blender. And that master blender oversees everything from the start to finish. And he essentially has a painter's palette. He's kind of, someone nicknamed him the Bob Ross of Canadian whiskey the other day. I like that.
Oh, I like that one.
I like that a lot. But yeah, he has a painter's palette, and he can take, if he wants to make Lot 40, which we'll take next, that's 100% rye grain, but it's from different distillates of rye. He'll blend those together as one straight rye. We'll do J.P. Weiser's 18. That's 100% corn grain. You can have Gooderham and Worts, which is a 7 distillate 4 grain. We're going to try an 11 distillate whiskey tonight, which I'm and from the fermentation to the distillation to the aging, he can concentrate flavors up and down. And yeah, it's a beautiful scientific art form, what the men and women at Hiram Walker and Sons are doing to create these gorgeous expressions I get to talk about.
Well, it's kind of funny too, because I think there's been a ton of innovation in whiskey I would say in the last 5 to 10 years in all categories. Like, all categories are really expanding and really playing around with stuff. But a lot of people don't understand is, like, when Don puts that stuff down in a rum barrel or a wine barrel, he's not touching it for 3 to 5 years at least. Like, it's sort of a experiment.
Not necessarily true. And if we're regaging anything, it's 100 days for production purposes. If he puts, like, the Pike Creek into the rum barrels, it's there for 100 days for production purposes. But generally, after about the 60-day mark, it's not going to take much more from that barrel. That's how he explains it to us. So you could leave it in there for 5 years, but he says it's not going to take much more. Picking away at the barrel, it's going to certainly evaporate, and angels are going to drink a little more of it, but it's not going to take much from the previous liquid that was in the cask beforehand.
Okay, so what are we tasting next? That 15 Street, man. Like, I honestly, that would sit on my shelf, and I would go a completely different route. I think that was a fantastic starter. Like, that was a nice palate starter.
It's a nice, easy sipper. Exactly. You wouldn't want to end on that at the end of this, because we're going to have some complex whiskeys. So I was thinking this would be fun. I've not done this yet. If we did a side-by-side comparison of so you're familiar with it. I don't know if anyone that's tuned in is, but Lot 40, this is probably one of the more, this is why I'm here. It is a unique way compared to traditional methods with Canadian whiskey. It's 100% rye grain. We take an unmalted rye and we column distill it once, take away all the harsh qualities and characteristics, but leaves all the flavors in, and then we pot distill it afterwards. And the pot distillation, it's an 8,000 liter still. We pot distill it for 12 hours. That helps us separate all the flavors from the heads, the hearts, and the tails that will sometimes go into a straight rye whiskey. But Dr. Don gets rid of the heads and the tails. That's the green grass and soapy characteristics. And he keeps the hearts. And that's all the rye notes. That's the baking spices, the rye bread. That's the floral and citrus. And rye is a big beast of a grain. So he lays it down in brand new American oak. And that really tames the beast. It brings out all the warming vanilla, toffee, and caramel. And this has kind of been, if you could say, it's been the bartender's whiskey out of our expressions over the last 5 years. That's what I would say. This is the one that anywhere in the world we're sold. This is the one you find on back bars, you find on cocktail menus, you see bartenders using their rails, because it's a big rye. It holds its own. It makes a beautiful classic cocktail, but also it's got a firm elegance to it that you can blend in with citrus and cherries and bubbles and make really nice drinks.
And to be honest, I've been using it for years, but like tasting it by itself, it gets that really beautiful, like tannic black tea, lemon peel, that sort of thing. And I always thought the spice was really aggressive. And it was, to be, and this is, I'm going to be very blunt. It wasn't until I always used it for very specific flavor profiles. And then me and my team, we started really perfecting all our classics. So we really started working on all the classics. So we did like a Manhattan. Do we do a Manhattan with Sazerac rye? Do we do it Lot 40? Do we do it this? And so on and so forth, the Jim Beam rye and that sort of stuff. And Lot 41, we did it blind. And Lot 41 over and over and over again. And it didn't go in the Sazerac because we have the Sazerac rye, but like it was damn, like it was close. Like we were like both going. And so for me, I like to be surprised after all this time, like that my preconceived notions of something are completely screwed. And that's what I kind of liked about it, because I was like, man, this Manhattan is freaking epic. And because it was blind, I didn't know which one I was like praising. And so now it's our house rye for most of our cocktails, because you said it perfectly. But when you taste it by itself, it's punchy. It's got like some flavor to it. And I was like, man, that's going to kill a lot of things. Like, that's going to kill like dry vermouth. That's going to kill citrus. All you're going to taste is that black tea and lemon peel. But yeah, now I've got a newfound respect for it in the last 6 months.
I love it. And you touched on it. Rye is not a whiskey that generally I sip on. Like, I don't go and grab a big American rye that I love and sip on it. This, though, I've noticed in the last several years is like going to big beer whiskey bars in the US, and they'll have it side by side in a Boilermaker, which I love seeing, because it's got, I mean, some people will say Americans have a bigger palate compared to Canadians or Europeans. And, you know, people can argue that, but they do like a big whiskey. And I just think this is great to sip on its own. I usually mix it in cocktails, to be quite honest. But, you know, it's a rye through and through. Nobody can argue that. I think you said little black tea notes, a little bit of banana. I hear from people, I always hear this, people who will say mint or sour cherry. Certainly a little bit of tobacco, lots of vanilla.
Yeah.
It's got a real sweetness to it.
And I think that's the hard thing in Canada, because we get a lot of American ryes up here, but the American ryes are just exorbitantly priced. They're priced to a point where you're like, this should be a sipping whiskey. But no, it's Rittenhouse. You should be mixing with this. No one's sipping Rittenhouse 100 because it's $55 a bottle at the liquor store. Like, you know.
Well, and to sip on, I mean, what we love about American rye is, you know, it's got that nice kind of punch to the jaw. I'm saying this too much, but like Lot 40's got that kind of, it's a little bit more of a love slap. Just, you know, it wakes you up. Like it's a big, complex, bold whiskey, but you know, my eyes open up wide every time I try it.
Yeah, I've got a newfound love, and you know, I've always loved supporting anything you do when it comes to whiskey. But in the last 6 months, I've been playing around with a lot of classics and putting it directly up against like American ryes that people are sort of drawn to, and it's been coming out like 1-2 spot, like first and second spot every single time. It's awesome.
I love hearing that, and I can't wait until I'm allowed to get back on a plane, and then I'm out there.
I do it blind because I've got a couple of questions. I got a question from Sarah Bryden coming up, but the one thing I hate about bartenders normally is that they discredit Canadian whiskey, but then they talk the virtues of American rye, especially Whistle Pig and Mastersons, that buy Canadian whiskey and then do a little bit of aging. And I really don't love the fact, like, that's why I've been doing a lot of blind tasting, because I want it to be completely just my head, not knowing. Let's taste it and see which one's the best.
Yeah, I like that. And I mean, it is what it is. It's a slow burn, you know. In the almost 7 years I've been doing this, is like people are having their eyes open, they're learning. Like, the more we educate, Gina and I and the team here, Claire and Colin, like the more we can educate on the category. So I think that's why we're station. No brands of Canadian whiskey have ever truly, really educated. You know, what the first seminar at Tales, that was 6 years ago with yourself, Davin, and I, and it was a Lot 40 JP Weiser's 40 Creek thing, and it was, thank God we started doing that because people need the education on the category.
So we've got the Lot 40, the regular, the 100% rye.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it is really good. Talk us through the dark oak, which only got released a little while ago.
Yeah, so I'm excited. So this is Lot 40 dark oak, and I don't know, it's in BC. I don't know if people can see the label. It's a very pretty black label. I can't move the right way with my camera. Look at me. It's made in the same sense, like the core essence of Lot 40. It's that 100% unmalted rye, column, and then pot distilled, aged in new oak. Now, the new oak that Dr. Don ages it in is 2 millimeter char. And essentially for this, the idea came up, and again, it's whiskey makers talking with marketers and experimenting with things, and then the company wanting to release it. And Don took that Lot 40 rye and he put it into a 4 millimeter New American oak. And, he finished it in that essentially. And that brought on even bolder spices of the rye notes. It brought on heavier, warming vanilla notes and sweet toffee caramel. It bottled it at 48 ABV compared to the 43. So it's up a couple notches. Now this, I've only had this a couple times because it's not available in Ontario yet. It's just in BC.
Really?
It's just in BC right now.
How is that possible?
It's going to be at the LCBO in February. It's in their warehouses. I can't tell you when they're going to put it on their shelves, but they do have it. And then the idea, if it goes as well in Ontario, it will get released around the country. Now this,
Is it going to be a special release always, or is there a sort of fine line of like, oh, this is done really well, this may be a regular SKU, or is this one of these ones that would just stick as a special release?
I can't say for sure because I'm not the brand team or the boss. I'm just a lowly brand ambassador. But the rumor mill, if this does well, I think you'll see it as a regular SKU. And like I said, I've been lucky enough. I've got my hands on a couple bottles and shared some with a few friends to see what they think. And, the only complaint I got from one of my buddies over Christmas was his wife and her girlfriends drank it all and he didn't get any. So it's like, so far I'm hearing some pretty good feedback on it, but I love it. It's like, it's just almost like I'm stealing this from somebody. It's like almost like a roasted pecan kind of color to it. It's a little lighter, lots of pear and apple, tree fruit, rye again, warm honey, lots of oak.
I feel like the dark oak is the one thing, the one whiskey that would pick a fight with you, and the regular Lot 40 would be like, "Come on, man, we're all friends here. What are you doing? Like, just chill, just chill."
It's quite possible. I like that. I mean, your first sip, like, it's a big whiskey. It's full. It seems pretty complex. Lots of heavy rye. Feel it all right here. As Dawn calls it, the Canadian hug. I get lots of white pepper. Certainly some walnuts, toasted sugar, lots of the charred wood off of this. I love it. I've been playing around with it in cocktails. Again, it's about a $20 price difference from the normal Lot 40, so I don't think you'll see people using it necessarily in cocktails, but it's fun to play with at home.
What have you been playing with it in?
Blair Phillips did a piece on it just before the new year, and he asked if I would make a cocktail, so I don't want to be that guy, but yeah, I had some nice sherry that I used it and blended with it. And then what was the syrup? It was like a fig cardamom kind of clove syrup.
Yeah.
And it was just kind of like a really complex twist on an old fashioned. There's nothing to it, but a little bit of sherry in there and the figs and cardamom and cloves and cinnamon. It was really nice.
Because on the nose in that first sip, you're expecting it to be quite almost sticky sweet, like almost like very like that pecan pie, that sort of thing, like straight like to finish, but it is quite dry. Like it is quite a dry finish. It doesn't have a lot of residual, like any sort of residual sweetness whatsoever. But yeah,
it's that rye through and through. I love the stuff. I hope it does well, because I'd like to see this kicking around on shelves and not going anywhere.
Just a really good old fashioned would be fantastic with this. So let's get to a question. Sarah Brydon, what do you guys think is the next biggest trend for cocktails, classics? Look at this. Look how fancy this is. Look at how fancy that is. You can see it in everything. What do you think is the next biggest trend for whiskey cocktails, classics? What do you recommend for creating for their cocktail lists?
Good question. And hi, Bryden. Do you know Sarah? You know Sarah probably.
Of course, Sarah. She's the queen bee rep from Victoria.
Yeah,
she was way cooler here before she moved back to Toronto.
Well, and I mean, it's because she's an East Coaster. It's because she's from where I'm from, almost Nova Scotia, but we're all pretty good there. It's a great question. I don't know if I have an answer exactly. Like, certainly where classic cocktails, I mean, I can think back to trying to make classic cocktails in Toronto, Canada's biggest city, in 2005, 2006, and people didn't want them because it was straight booze. Certainly like the classics.
Oh, I remember those days.
Oh, God. Threw so much stuff down the drain. Anyway, the classics, I mean, the resurgence is here. They're here to stay. I think it's fantastic for Canadian whiskey. Because, I mean, you look at the books of late 1800s, early 1900s, and it was generally American rye or Canadian whiskey. Right here, you got the best of both worlds. It's a Canadian whiskey that's 100% rye. I think trends, I mean, the non-alcoholic cocktail trend has been exploding. Not that that's going to help me, but it's really nice to see bartenders, drink creators, like really putting an effort into non-alcoholic cocktails. And then I've talked about this with many people, Gord Hanna, for instance, recently, which Bryden knows well. I'm curious to see when this is all over and, we get back out there, if drinks will simplify again, because really in the last few years, it's been incredible creations that bartenders have been putting together, like mind-blowing stuff. Some of the ingredients they create now, I wonder, but I mean, you have to charge for that. Mm-hmm. It's like, it's not uncommon to find a $16 or $18 cocktail in downtown Toronto. I don't know about the rest of Canada right now, but I wonder if those days are going to take a break and maybe go back to simple classics.
Do you think there's going to be a little influence from the fact of lockdowns and stuff? Like, I feel the consumer knowledge has gone through the roof because every bartender and his dog are doing live streams. Like, how many cocktail seminars and videos have you done for the general public since lockdown has happened that you would never even think about doing in person back in the day? Like, all of a sudden we've got Zoom and we've got Restream and we've got Instagram Live and everybody's making cocktails. I'm really curious to see how the general public their knowledge has risen, and they may be pounding Manhattans at home for the last 8 months, and when they get out to the bar, are they going to keep drinking Manhattans, or are they going to go back to those really crazy concoctions that bartenders have been known for?
I think I mean, to answer your question, I don't know how many. It was like my flights before the pandemic. I just stopped counting. So I stopped counting how many live, trainings and stuff, because everything I do now is a live training. Whether it's making cocktails, it's from my little breakfast nook. I don't know. I think so many things are going to happen. Everyone's talking about the Roaring 20s coming back, and I think that's certainly. When everybody gets a thumbs up and everyone's vaccinated, I think people are going to go nuts, especially my friends. I mean, some people, will the home delivery cocktail craze and bottled cocktail go away, or will that remain? Will big corporations, I was talking to my friend in Calgary tonight. He had a delivery of 500 cocktail kits to all the staff at his company around Canada that we're going to have old fashions tonight. Will that continue? Because I think so. I mean, that's a great way to get everybody to bond together, and people. It's a lot cheaper than flying everyone.
Oh yeah,
one big and take everyone out for dinner. Like, will the get-togethers with big companies be more virtual now? Maybe.
I'm a little nervous because like how many bar shows have gone virtual this year. I'm like, I don't want bar shows to stay virtual. Like, I want to go to Berlin for BCB. I don't want to do a live stream to BCB. I want to be in Berlin. I want to be in New York. I want to be in Toronto. I don't want to keep these virtual bar shows going.
I don't see the virtual bar. I mean, it's fantastic that everybody is. Sorry, I'm going to say it, to do that right now, because you need to do something to have everyone there. But I think it's more difficult to get people to sign up. It's certainly difficult to get anyone to pay. Like, they have to happen because we need that human connection. We need human contact. You've got to be there. Every talk I do, everyone says, thank you. It's really great. We can't wait to have you in person, because you can't read the room. You know, you can't. I can tell one of my horrible jokes, and I don't know if anyone's laughing. So I know they're probably not.
Is that a good feeling or a bad feeling though? Like, do you feel like you just kill every single seminar that you do? Every single seminar, you just walk out of that going, man, I just nailed that. Everybody got my jokes. Everybody was having a good time.
No, I know that no one's laughing at my jokes, but the odd person. No, things have to. And I mean, maybe it'll be 2022. Maybe 2021 won't be the year of cocktail festivals and concerts coming back. But everyone's going to need to get back to doing that. Like, just the social aspect of being together in one room and seeing other and sitting in an audience, learning from people is just much nicer. 100%. I hope it gets back to that.
So what are we moving on to? Man, I'm really, like, I feel I'm getting more from this session than I've ever got from a regular whiskey tasting. I'm enjoying myself. What's next?
We're going to do, I've never had this whiskey.
Really?
7 Rebels. I know, this is kind of, I'm going to pour a decent thing here.
Is this the BC thing as well?
Yeah. So anyone watching and probably like, why the hell has he not had this whiskey? It's the light.
Yeah,
too bright of a light. JP Weiser's 7 Rebels. I had to kind of, twist some people's arms to get a bottle of this a while back, because it was initially made for the BC market, and I believe it was an offering launched to coincide with the British Columbia Liquor Store annual whiskey release, because there's always so many incredible diverse whiskeys at that release. I've been out there talking many times. And 7 Rebels, again, marketing, whiskey making. The marketing, 7 of the rebels who started Canadian whiskey off. You've got your JP Weiser, who was an American. You've got Henry Corby, was from the UK. You've got Hiram Walker, another American. You've got William Gooderham, James Worts. You've got Harry Hatch. You've got Joseph Seagram. These are some of the bigger names that really did start the Canadian whiskey trend. They were innovators. They were risk takers. They were the people that, honestly, they built our towns, cities, and country. They were the first taxpayers. So this was kind of huge. They the fact that Don says this a bunch, and I completely agree with them. I don't know why there's not legal tender, like one of our money notes that has the Canadian whiskey barons on it. Like, it just makes sense. They really did. Their money helped build this country. Anyway, this was kind of made in honor of them. And this is pretty complex. I was talking to Gina about it today, who looks after things in the US with us, and I'm excited to try it. This is, it's bottled at 42.8 ABV. Beautiful bronze color. Now, I believe it's 7 distillates in here. That would only make sense, right? It's soft double column distilled corn and new wood. Speyside malt barrels, apparently. It's got Canadian whiskey casks that have smoked inserts and spice inserts. Dawn's. It's got column and pot distilled rye, which is your lot 40. It's got column and pot distilled wheat. It's got some rye and barley malt in it. So it's a pretty complex blend he put together.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you're tasting. I feel bad for anyone watching. I'm very Canadian. I'm sorry that you're not able to.
Yeah, so you're way more Canadian than I am. I'm like, I don't care if you haven't got this. That's not my fault. That's on you. I have seen some still kicking around on the shelves and stuff. Like, I think there is still some kicking around in BC liquor stores.
I was going to say, I think is anyone from BC watching, I don't think you have an issue. Anyone else, you're going to have to call a friend in BC and have it shipped. I mean, it's the only bottle I have. I always like to hold on to one of our expressions and not open it if it's something rare. But now I'm going to have to go on the hunt to find another one.
I'll ship you one.
I like your style. I'll probably have something I can send to you. I mean, off this right now, I'm getting a lot of the kind of wood embers. I'm getting the toasted malts, almost like an orange.
Yeah,
orange, kind of little honey.
This is
nutmeg,
really
actually.
If you threw this in a flight, like a blind flight, this would be a hard pick to categorize as like a Canadian whiskey.
It's nice. It's, I mean, very JP Weiser style. It's soft.
Yeah.
It's got something to it, but it's not like punching me in the jaw. Get a lot of dried fruits off that.
I'm not sure if anyone can see the legs, but the legs are just ridiculous on that. Yeah, I would say that if you threw that in a blind tasting, that would be a hard pick. I'd be curious what you'd throw in the blind tasting. I threw some Scotch malts in there as well, like maybe a couple of blendeds. And
it's nice. It's great.
That's why I like. Again, I like blind tasting. I like people not knowing exactly what they're going to taste, because then people's all their inhibitions and brand and all that sort of stuff that sways people's opinions on things just gets pulled away and taken down. Like, I've done a couple of tastings off topic. I've done a couple of tastings where I've taken blended Scotch malts and single malts and done a blended versus single malt and paired up two whiskeys that are very similar flavor profile, but one's a single malt, one's a blend. And I don't usually have the Scotch malt whiskey geeks show up for that because they don't want to be called out for liking thing. Talisker Storm and Cutty Sark side by side, you will have a hard time discerning those two.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, there's been a couple of times where I'm like, oh man, did I screw up my pours? Because they're that close. Like, that close. And it's like Talisker Storm's a $80 bottle of whiskey. Cutty Sark Prohibition's a $30 bottle of whiskey.
Yeah. Well, and and as we kind of said earlier, it's like that is certainly, that's going away, but that was the problem with Canadian whiskey forever. It was, everything was that soft double column distilled corn, aged in used casks, maybe a pinch of rye.
This is a Sunday night tipple. This is like, enjoy a couple of ounces of this and just sit by the fire.
Yeah. If you're watching Dr. Don, I'll need another bottle of this. This is pretty good. And then I was going to say, what's our time like? We probably got to push along, huh?
That's all good. We've got no time. I don't want you to be up too late. I know it's getting past your bedtime, old man. But
yeah, my imaginary rich girlfriend was going to fly us to the Caribbean this weekend, but that's not happening anymore.
So let's go before we go to the next whiskey. I saw that. We've been pretty lucky in BC. Like, we haven't had major lockdowns, all that sort of stuff. So like, when people sort of start getting whingy moany on me, I'm like, we're not in Toronto, we're not in Montreal. Like, let's be really honest. Like, we're not in Manitoba. We've been pretty freaking lucky. Like, you guys are on your third lockdown, and we've still got indoor dining. Like, we've still got people coming in and drinking and eating inside. So we should just count our lucky stars.
I always forget, like, I was on a call over the holidays with the group of bartenders that I brought to Fogo Island a few years ago, like Kate Bushell, Amber Bruce, Shane, Kasuga, Gord, the whole crew. We always have little catch-ups, and we were all locked in our apartments, nowhere to go. And Amber had to take a break because she had to go look after her bar, and like, she brought the camera around with all of the people eating, drinking, socializing. I was like, I don't want to say what I said to her, but we were like, holy Christ, Amber, like, you forget being over on this side of the country, you forget how things are on your side. So good on you guys.
I got a question before we move on to the next whiskey from James. James is actually the owner and one of the master distillers at Sons of Vancouver in Vancouver.
Hi.
Yeah, they make an epic amaretto. They do it April. If you don't know much about this, they do an April Fool's Day. You know how most companies do an April Fool's like product?
Mm-hmm.
They did it. Instead, they actually made it So
amazing. What do they make?
Oh yeah. So a couple of years ago, they did a blue curacao, a craft blue curacao. They did a coconut rum, like a coconut honey rum. So they made a rum style out of honey or samel, and then infused it with desiccated coconuts. And then this year's April Fool's was a coconut cream liqueur. And so all the like in Seattle, like people come up and buy cases of this stuff because for their tiki drinks. So the tiki community in Seattle make this massive drive up, pack their cars full of Sons of Vancouver April Fool's products, and drive back down to the States.
That's incredible.
So because James and I have talked about this in the past. Why don't we see more Canadian cask strength whiskies? It does seem to be an interesting pattern of like Canadian cask strengths. And then the next year it's dry for a year, 2 years, and then all of a sudden more cask strengths. So why don't we get more Canadian cask strength whiskies?
We're going to try one. We're going to end tonight with a cask strength. Here's, again, my honest answer. This is not a marketing answer. I don't have an exact answer. I can think back to when I started with the company with Don, master blender, and he'd take me out. We'd taste barrels, and he knew I was a lot 40 freak, and I would ask him, I'm like, can you fill a bottle up of this cask strength for me? He'd be like, well, not really. Why? I said, well, I'm going to Tales of the Cocktail next week off some cask Canadian whiskey. And, everyone knows the story now. It was like, sure, but don't let anyone put this on social media. Don't show it off. We shouldn't be doing it. And, and of course, everybody I taste, I'm like, just don't show this off. Don't put it on social media. Everybody puts it on social media. Blah, blah, blah. We start bringing it around because we realize people are loving it. And we start bringing little samples to whiskey shows and cocktail shows. And essentially, it was the community, the whiskey community and the bar community online. They started demanding a lot 40 cask strength that our company eventually went, all right, we hear you. We'll put one out. And we've done 3 variations so far, a 12-year and 11-year. And then Don decided to start playing with the cask the next year. And he went vanilla, cinnamon sweetness to it. And it had more positive reviews than we thought in the beginning because some people didn't like that it was different. But when I would bring it to the US and overseas, they went nuts over it. Canadian palates, not as much, but that's the way it is. And then we've seen other Canadian whiskeys come out with cask strengths. And one thing that I'd been asking for a few years was for JP Weisers to play around with it, because I think one of the most misunderstood categories of Canadian whiskey is that soft double column distilled corn that a lot of people will call base whiskey, which it is beautiful and incredible. So we did a 23-year-old cask strength 2 years ago, and then we're going to try the 22-year-old cask strength tonight. I know that's not really answering James's question. I'm same as him. I hope we start seeing more of it. I know that there's a couple pretty cool lot 40 cask strengths coming down the line, which I probably can't speak about yet, but there's some really unique finishings with the cask strengths in lot 40 coming. So Don's been having a lot of fun with his team, and the Corby team's liking what he's doing. So I think we're going to see some cool stuff coming from us at least, and I hope from other brands as well.
I still think that cask strength is still a bit of a niche market. Like, you sort of almost jumping a hurdle before you should be jumping that hurdle. Like, we're still getting people on board with Canadian whiskey in Canada. Let's not slap a cask strength on for a very 1% niche of people. But I do agree. I do like my cask strength. That's usually how I drink my bourbons and my bonded and that sort of thing. So like, I think there's room for it, but it's not going to keep your lights on and pay your paycheck at all.
No, I don't think we're. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'd like to see, and I know the discussions have happened about just releasing a cask strength that would be on shelves at all time. Is that out of the cards? No. I mean, I'd like to see it happen. Especially like when I'm in the US, Americans go nuts over the cask strength. They, it's really kind of an American thing. But now in Canada, like you say, it's niche. It's becoming more common. But whiskeys in Canada, like you really didn't. I mean, now it's becoming a thing, and it's like you say, it's not something you drink all the time. I mean, I can think of being in Windsor, and our old buddy Tom one night was making me cocktails, and all of a sudden it was like the third one in, and I'm like, whew. I was like, these are a little stronger than normal. I was like, you're not making these old fashions with cask strength, are you? And he goes, well, yeah. And I was like, hey. I was like, come on, man. I was like, just don't do that to me. And he was having a good laugh, but I was like, there's not much to go around. Like, don't waste it on me in cocktails.
James has a nice little follow-up question here. Come on, Dave, just tell me what the finishes are.
I would like to. I don't know if I'd get in trouble for that.
Dr. Don is like Dr. Don is like super nice and like laid back, but I'm still scared of him. Like I wouldn't want to cross Dr. Don in a like if you start like doing stuff that Don doesn't want you to do. I feel like he's scarily passive, like passive scary. like if I do something that's going to piss off Don, I'm going to hear about it real quick.
He's a sweetheart. But yeah, you don't want to mess with the master blender. And I mean, to be fair, I think he's talked about some of these expressions in the past, but it's not my place to talk about things that aren't released yet. I'll let him do that.
He'll release the Dave Mitton whiskey, and you know it's just going to be like the weirdest thing ever. And go, you know what? I'm going to put your name on a whiskey. You've been asking for it for years. Here's your whiskey. Done. So what's up next? We're going to do this one. Because originally we were going to do the Trinity, right?
Yeah. Well,
and then
the thing with West Coast is there's not tons of Gooderham and Worts of the traditional Gooderham and Worts sold in BC. And Colin McDougall, our West Coast ambassador, I'm like, hey, we were coming up with the whiskeys that we could find. And I said, can you find me some kind of, I'm like, even just the traditional Gooderham and Worts is one of my favorite blends we have. And he called me and he goes, I think we have the Little Trinity. And I was joking with you. I was half thinking of having him send that to me instead of bringing it to you because it's one of my favorite whiskeys and you can't find it. And you texted me today. Thank God you let me know that you had the 11 souls. So there was a cross in communications there. But I'm also impressed that there's 11 souls in BC.
Well, I was stressed because I was like, you were so excited for the Little Trinity. I was excited to be excited with you for the Little Trinity. And then when I got the box today and I got this, I'm like, oh, dude, this is what they gave me. Is this cool? And you were like, oh, that's even better. I'm like, oh, sweet. Now I'm even more excited for this one.
I just have not even heard of any of this left. So, I mean, if anyone's listening and they know where some is, let me know. And I want to buy some because, again, this is the last bottle I have. I'm on the search for another bottle now, one that's closed. So, for those that don't know, because we don't get taught this stuff in school, Gooderham and Worts, James Gooderham, William Gooderham, James Worts, came to the town of York, which is the city of Toronto. In the year 1832, they were grain millers. This could be a 2-hour story, so I'll make it 2 minutes. They were grain millers who eventually started distilling whiskey. They were the ones who patented the double column distillation, which Canadian whiskey is known for, that light, soft Canadian whiskey. Then all whiskey makers were pretty much producing pot distilled, unaged whiskey, moonshine, essentially. When these guys start double column distilling, making the soft whiskey, it explodes. The rest of Canadian whiskey producers start mimicking, doing the same thing. Gooderham and Worts does so well, by the year 1877, they had become the world's largest distillery, producing 2.5 million gallons of spirit annually in downtown Toronto. It's crazy to think. Now, they grew. They're bigger. I mean, the distillery is no longer open. It is an entire neighborhood called the Distillery District now. And it is 190 acres. It is massive, and it feels like you're walking in a movie. It still looks like 1832 outside. Gorgeous. They were Canada's first taxpayers. They were instrumental at building Toronto. They really helped build the city of Toronto, worked with the railroads. They helped build Canada. Big deal in Canadian history. Now, I always say that the Gooderham and Worts brand really is that cross of marketing and whiskey making. I mean, the idea of the original Gooderham and Worts that we sell, they were grain millers that worked with 4 grains. Let's make a 4-grain whiskey. So Don came up with a 4-grain, 7 distillate whiskey aged in cheap casks. Stunning. Bottled at 44.4 ABV, all 4s. So this, I can't say I had a hand in this, but I was around the table one night in Detroit where there were a few of us talking about a Gooderham and Worts expression. And our former ambassador, Spencer Gooderham of the Gooderham family, was telling us a story about when the family did make their way over in the mid-1800s to Canada from England on the boat. It was a family, whole family coming over. It was 54 people coming to Canada, migrating. And long story short, a few parents died because it was harsher times. It's kind of a sad story, but by the time they got here, William Gooderham, there were 11 children without parents.
Oh, wow.
And William adopted them. They didn't take his last name, but he adopted them and raised them and paid their way and, made sure that they were all right. He had money, obviously. So the idea was like, what if we created an 11 distillate whiskey? And, we were kind of talking about it, like it's just crazy and unheard of in the Canadian whiskey realm. And Don's sitting there sipping on a Manhattan. He goes, yeah. He's like, I think I could figure most of that out right now, but I'll need to go play around. And we're like Don Livermore, of course. So we're about to have an 11 distillate whiskey. And I had to write this down so I wouldn't get it wrong. But it's 11 different barrels that he selected to make this. It's corn, rye, wheat, and barley. It's got rye and barley malt in it, but less than 5%. He did use ex-Canadian whiskey, American oak. There is a wheat, rye, barley malt, rye malt that was all column and pot distilled. There's a column distilled rye. It's very American style, kind of J.P. Weiser's. There's a double column distilled corn. That's ever come out of this distillery. It's 49 ABV or 98 proof. The age variant goes from 21-year-old, 17, 11, 9, and 3-year-old in here.
Jesus.
I've not had this in a couple of years, so I'm excited. I'm looking at it. I'm like, it's a medium golds.
Well,
lots of vanilla, toffee.
Yeah. Before, I remember this very distinctly. I remember reading, and I don't read books too often, but Davin's very first edition of Canadian Whiskey, he has that whole chapter on Gooderham and Worts, and it is so well written and so, like, it makes you feel like you're there, like literally how you just told the story. Like, it makes you feel like you were there, and then the slight, like, decline of Gooderham and Worts during World War II and all this sort of, or World War One. Was it World War One or World War Two? And this sort of, two, where the family decline and infighting and all this. Like, the story is like, if you could do a mini series, like a Gooderham and Worts mini series, like the way that Davin wrote about it was like perfect. I can imagine the characters when I was reading it. It was amazing.
Oh, I've always joked when I said Harry Hatch. I'm going to guess you're not overly familiar with Harry Hatch when I say the name.
I do know it purely because of you.
Yeah. If I ever had 10 minutes with Martin Scorsese's, I could sell the next movie. Because Harry Hatch, like, you think back, the mid-1800s, I mean, you look at these guys, it looks like gangs in New York. The Gooderham Walker. Harry Hatch was a salesperson at one of the distilleries. I'm not going to get into it. Where essentially it's an hour-long story. He essentially ended up buying all of our distilleries. He came up with the money and the funds to buy Goodham and Warts, Hiram Walker, J.P. Weiser's. Was our rum runner. Like, if any Canadian had any connection with Al Capone and during those times, it probably would have been Harry Hatch, because he was the guy who used to force sailors to bring whiskey across the border. Like, he would have been a tough old boy. And I just see an entire miniseries or movie being filmed on Harry Hatch and all the Canadian whiskey barons.
And he just, I think he was in the right place at the right time. Post World War II, when a lot of distilleries are making like fuel and alcohol for the war effort to power tanks and stuff. Like, after World War II happened, and sort of everybody was like, oh, do we, after that long period, they're like, oh, do we go back to whiskey, or what are we going to do? And he was just in the right place at the right time. He's like, I'm going to buy you for cents on the dollar. I'm going to buy you for cents on the dollar. I'm going to buy you for cents on the dollar.
Yeah. Yep. And that was it. And, he was, again, we don't learn this stuff in school. You don't learn about whiskey makers who were selling whiskey illegally, and building the category. But big part of it, like, so much fun Canadian history. This was, I'm sure this was a pain and fun for Don and the whiskey makers at Hiram Walker to put together. But, oh my God, I wish there was more of this. Like, this is gorgeous.
It is.
I completely forgot.
Yeah.
Like,
and every time
the green apple.
Every time you go back to it, you pick up something else. Like, you go back to it, you taste it, you're like, oh, I get that really soft, like, nice corn sort of flavor. Then you go back to it, and you're like, oh, there's that bright, almost acidic wheat note. And then you go back to it, it's like, oh, there's that spice note going out this way. It is something incredible.
Yeah. This is one when you have, like, your gents this afternoon who scoffed at Canadian whiskey. I'm like, I just want to pour them a little of this.
Blind tasting, baby. It's the way to go.
Yeah.
So before we go into the last one, because the last one's very special, I actually haven't cracked this. I cracked this for the very first time because it is a signed bottle. I don't usually crack signed bottles because I'm not going to crack a bottle from Dr. Dong too quickly. It has to be a special occasion. What is, like, let's give people some sort of, like, visual. So just how big that rick house is that you have access to, because we've only tasted like a small portion. Like, Pikes Creek, I think, is one of the brands that you rep and you guys make that I think is super underrated across Canada. I think Pikes Creek is spectacular. But so there's sort of like little underdog side brand that it just does really well. I've loved every single, the rum cask, the Oloroso sherry, all money.
Yeah.
What sort of rick house does, like, Don have access to? Like, I just feel like he's always walking through with a cane, just checking out his rick house. Just walking around and, like, checking his barrels like he would check sheep or cattle. Like, how some of these barrels? Like, what access?
Well, first of all, it's usually me walking behind him with an umbrella. Very P. Diddy. No, it's it's incredible. We've got Pike Creek. You mentioned the brand Pike Creek. I happen to have one sitting there.
That one's a great one. I love that one.
Won Canadian Whiskey of the Year last year, which is pretty cool. Beautiful 21-year-old corn whiskey finished in sherry cask, Oloroso. We currently have 1.6 million barrels laying down.
Excuse me, what?
We have 1.6 million barrels of whiskey laying down.
Jesus.
It's 16 warehouses. The barrels are stacked upright, 6 pallets high. It is a sight to behold. The first way I learned was the first time I went was they hadn't had the garage doors open up very long. And I got inside and I wanted to walk from start to finish and all around, and I wasn't allowed to. And I couldn't understand why. I'm like, why can't I walk from this door to the other door? And they're like, they haven't been open for an hour yet. You wouldn't make it. I said, what do you mean? They're like, if you tried to walk from this door to that door right now, you'd be asphyxiated, like you would pass out from the fumes.
Jesus.
And I wanted to challenge them, but they wouldn't let me. But it's like, it is, like you say, it's 1.6 million barrels of whiskey laying down. So we've been making whiskey since 1857, and we make a lot of it. To put it into perspective, drain and fill every day in an 8-hour period. We empty and fill 1,300 barrels every 8 hours.
Really?
Yeah,
Wow.
it is a Hiram and Sons. I won't say it's the largest distillery in North America. I think by square footage it might be. I know we don't have the most barrels. It is a massive factory with a really, like, you can see the big crazy column stills and the 19 grain silos that hold those 100,000 metric tons of corn. Well, not all at once. But then, there's the little tiny side to it too. It's like that little 8,000 liter pot still where Lot 40 is made. And I can tell everybody, Lot 40 sold in the 20 countries around the world right now. Like, all of it comes from that little pot still.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a big, massive factory side. I mean, it's not a secret. We make Malibu for North and South America. It's a lot of Malibu, Shawn. There's a lot of bottles of Malibu. But we produce, and again, most of it's written about. I don't ever speak about it, but we produce a lot of other spirits, vodkas, gins, rums, liqueurs. People hire us to make a lot of their spirits as well, their recipes, because that's the way it works. That's business nowadays. You and I could start a whiskey company tomorrow and buy whiskey from Hiram Walker if we wanted to. I don't think we should do that. But yeah, it's the nature of the beast.
When you're ready to retire.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll just let the professionals do that right now. But yeah, Pike Creek, that's the area where our warehouses are built, because you can't have those warehouses down near the distillery in the middle of downtown on the water. They're about 25 minutes away from the downtown core, just in case there's ever any explosions, which hopefully there never will be.
So what's the I know this might be privy information. What's the oldest barrels you've got sitting around? Because I think people don't really understand the concept of old barrels. Like, if something's been aged for 20 years, 25 years, 30 years, like, wood deteriorates. Barrels aren't like good, like in the way of structure, for years and years and years and years and years. Like, people don't have 40-year-old decks outside the back of their house. Like, you can't expect wood to stay like good for that long. So like, when we're getting to these really old expressions, like, these barrels have been sitting around for a while. Like, how old are some of the barrels in the rick house that Don can do a little dab off?
It's a great question. I should find out the exact age. I don't know if they'd know the oldest one, because, like I say, the oldest whiskey we've ever put out is 35 years old. I don't know what the oldest barrels are kicking around. I know there's some very old barrels because it's Canadian whiskey. Yeah. Don will use those barrels until they fall apart. He'll reuse them. So it's like, there's some old barrels. And you think of things like the 35-year-old or 18-year-old, like, if it sits that barrel for 18 years and then it gets reused a few more times, like, that's still for an 18-year-old whiskey. Yeah. So even if you're only using it 3 times, yeah, there's some old barrels in those warehouses. There's some. I asked Don once, this is when I was brand new to the job, I'm like, so in barrels, like, do you ever come across anything that you've lost or was misplaced by a previous distiller or master blender? And, I'm trying to get some kind of a romantic story. And it's Don. He's like, no. He's like, that doesn't happen. He's like, and I mean, that's why you love Dongs. He's like, no. And he explains to me, he's like, we get audited twice a year. He's like, every barrel in here is accounted for. In fact, there's not a pile, but there's a section. If you go in and you see a couple broken barrels in a pallet, and you'd be like, why are they keeping that in here? It's because if there was an accident and the barrel broke, they need to keep it while they're being audited to show that there's not a missing barrel. So it's like, everything is so accounted for. But I thought maybe someday we could, marketing could come up with, like, we found a lost barrel. And Don's like, no, there's no such thing. You don't lose barrels. It's like, that's marketing.
Well, the thing is, like, I think that romance story comes from Bruichladdich. When Bruichladdich, like, became big again, like, everybody was talking about, like, all these lost barrels and, like, no codes, no chalk, no nothing. Like, what is this barrel full of? Like, what is it? Where does this barrel come from? Like, that romantic story, which is awesome. Like,
it's amazing.
It's a great story. There's a couple of breweries. There's a brewery in Vancouver that I know they made like a sour beer, like a Crake, but then they boarded it up behind a wall that they forgot about, and so they bricked. So all these
I did hear that.
Yeah, so all these kegs got bricked up behind a wall, and then they knocked the wall down, and there's all these kegs that are full of like 10 and 12-year-old like Crakes. And so that was a huge marketing plan for that whole distillery when they first, like 2-3 years in. Oh, we found all these kegs of like 10-year-old Crake that we forgot about. I'm like, come on. Like, how do you lose kegs?
I mean, for us, the one thing that Don explained to me is we might not lose barrels. They might all be accounted for. And as he said it, he's like, we don't lose barrels. He said, but I have a lot of things that were left to me. And I was like, how so? What do you mean? And he goes, from other previous distillers or master blenders, something that might not have been used. And then he has to now deal with it. Same way as if he decides someday to retire and pass on the mantle of master blender, he'll probably left stuff behind. Still have things aging. And for us, it was things like, again, marketing steps in. We had produced, I forget the amount. It was like 142 barrels or something, but someone had made a batch of Canadian whiskey. This is like back in the early 90s or something, or late 90s. They made it in a sense the way you'd make a bourbon. They didn't separate the grain, put it all together, and and Don came across it. No, he didn't come across it. He knew it was there, but he went to look on it one day, and I think it was 19 years or 17 years. This goes back a few years. But essentially, it would have been used to maybe blend into a whiskey, like that 9.09 rule. Got some samples, everyone tried it, and we're like, this is gorgeous. Like, it's stunning. But it wasn't made in the Canadian whiskey way. Not that that's a rule or regulation. You can pre-blend in the style of a bourbon. So J.P. Weiser's Last Barrels was released for Father's Day. And on the label, it said made in the style of an American bourbon, because it was. But we're not making it again. We don't even have the equipment to make it again. So it was kind of one of those things. They released it. It sold really well. I don't know if there's any bottles left. If anyone ever sees it. Yeah, it is a gorgeous whiskey. And you taste it and you're like, yeah, I feel like I'm drinking a bourbon right now. So things are left over, and you can come up with. But speaking of another, I don't know if this is a romantic whiskey.
It's a romantic whiskey.
I really like this whiskey. I've just been introduced to it, really. As we talked earlier when James was asking about cask strengths, J.P. Weiser's, Lot 40 was the cask strength, and J.P. Weiser's did a 22-year-old cask strength 2 years ago. And it did very well. People, responded to it. Having that big corn cask strength was great. This year, Don played around a little more. Last year, he went 22. He went a year younger because the previous was 23. Pardon me if I said 22. Cask strength, 59.7 ABV. This one, he did finish in French oak casks, which were seasoned with port. So you're looking at it, it's almost like a strawberry hue to it.
Yeah.
It's got kind of that, remember we had the Pike Creek finished in port cask years ago? It was almost more of a ruby red, but this has got like a kind of a red strawberry thing going. I think this one, I don't know if you'll understand this. You might, because you've had enough of our whiskeys, but I wouldn't use this in a tasting note, but it's kind of got that, well, it's a familiar like home to me now, but it's that Hiram Walker, like matured oak, lots of corn whiskey aged in those warehouses. When I smell our whiskeys, I kind of get the same thing from it.
That French twang, that French oak twang really comes through really nicely.
Yeah, it's very sweet. You get a lot of fruits on this. Berries, dried fruits, a little bit of floral.
Oh, I'm glad I cracked this with you. Oh,
that's right. You haven't had it either.
No,
it's big. It's bright. You know what? I'm not gonna lie. I was drinking this before we got on tonight because I was like to just numb my stage fright a little bit. You know what I get off this? And this is gonna sound like one of those pretentious tasting note things, but remember those? I know they're still around. I just haven't had them in years. Remember those like either vanilla or chocolate McCain cakes that would be frozen and you'd
Yes.
unfreeze? I get like a lot of vanilla cake off this.
Yeah. And that cast strength really plays well with the port finish. That sweetness of the port just takes that edge, that super harsh edge you get from cast whiskeys. Like that port just like takes that, rounds it off so nicely. Oh, this is fantastic.
Yeah, I love this. I mean, I think this is, again, I keep mentioning James, but I just like this question. If we keep putting stuff like this out and other brands keep putting out really nice cast strength whiskeys, I think it'll become a little more common. Like, I would challenge someone if they told me they didn't like Canadian whiskey or didn't like cast strength whiskey. I would pour them a little of this and say, tell me that after you've had a sip. Like, this is stunning. It's beautiful. It's complex, but it's not, because like I say, it's majority corn with a little bit of rye, but it's like how Don influences with the wood. Like that's what the doctor does. There's still lots of rye spice coming from this.
Yeah, it's still classic JP Wise. I think I don't envy Don in this way. Like you do have very specific categories in your portfolio that like you guys make. JP Wise's has this very, very specific flavor profile from the baseline, and that's going to rise up and throughout all like you can't have someone who is a JP Wise's fan, like the entry level JP Wise's move to lot 40 that quickly. Like it has to be this sort of slow progression. So JP Wise's always has this sort of twang to it. Goodenham and Warts has got this perfectness to it, and then the lot 40 range, and then the Pike Creek. They're all so individualistic. You wouldn't, if you put it before someone who never had Canadian whiskey before, no one would think that this is from the exact same distillery, the exact same master blender, because they're so specific in each category that they exist in.
Oh, it's true. When I'm tasting in the UK, which I spend a lot of time there, not the last 10 months, but you know, one thing is everyone assumes when I take them to the range that they're from different distilleries, because that's kind of a thing in the UK. I'm like, no, like it's all grain from the same province, brought to the same distillery, made by the same people, and it's just what you can do with blending.
Yeah,
it's that painter's palette, the Bob Ross Dr. Don thing.
I'm telling you, that's got to be a T-shirt. Please, can we do a T-shirt of Dr. Don painting a picture, going, oh, we're just going to put a little rice spice over here. Like, look at that.
It's not a horrible idea.
Look at that pretty rice spice. Look at it. He's just so happy, that rice spice.
I'll tell you, if Gina's watching right now, she's probably already taken a notes and probably going to make that happen. So if it does, I'll make sure you get credit for it, my friend.
Just make sure I get a T-shirt. That's all that matters. I got to do my bar shirt Friday every week. I want a Dr. Don Livermore painting a whiskey barrel on his thing, just saying, oh, we're just going to put a nice little rice spice there. Look at that rice spice. He's so happy to be here in this painting.
Done and done. Done and done.
So I want to tie it off, because we've tasted some amazing whiskeys. Man, for the first time I've done this, like my thing was, I always talk about business, I always talk about entrepreneurship and mental health and all the things that go along with the industry, but I just wanted to have a fun time with a friend drinking stuff. Actually, Johnny Gray has just jumped in and said nice, because John Gray was actually going to be my first one, and I had to like nix him because he's busy with like moving house and stuff. Not to say you weren't my first choice, but I was like, I always do whiskey. I'm always a whiskey head. I'm like, let's just go left field and do mezcal and tequila to start with. But the whiskeys have been epic. You're one of like the most prolific brand ambassadors, I think, in Canada, if not North America, when it comes to your passion for Canadian whiskey. Do you miss bartending? Do you miss, like, let's forget about COVID and stuff. Like, when you became a brand ambassador, do you miss like that sort of that hand-to-hand sort of tangible like thing when it comes to bartending and running your own venues, because you were one of the clinch pins in Toronto's cocktail culture? Do you miss that sort of atmosphere?
Hey, that's very sweet of you to say, but oh God, yes. I mean, the reason I made myself suffer for 15 years of owning and operating bars and restaurants and working behind the bar 5 nights a week was because I love the people. I loved entertaining people. I mean, I love the craft of bartending, obviously. I still have a hard time not calling myself a bartender. It's one of those, I can technically say I hit the 20-year mark of it. So I'll always feel that way. But yeah, I mean, I miss it every day. I miss all the good stuff. I don't think you'll see me back behind a bar as a full-time job again. Nobody would want to see that. I'd be moving a little slower. But, I always like to dabble here and there. And I mean, the nice thing is we'll see what happens after the lockdown. But generally, when I go to a market, I usually get invited behind one person's bar to make drinks for a few hours, which is pretty cool. And I've been able to work behind some really top-notch bars that I don't think I would have ever had the ability to do without this job. So it's been really nice where I still get to play on it a little bit. But yeah, I miss it.
So I think I've told the story a couple of times for you, between you and I, and I think I may have mentioned the podcast once. You were actually one of the very first Canadian bartenders that I actually knew before coming to Canada, because Opening Soon actually showed on like a random cable TV show in Australia, and you did Trotsky's.
Chahosky, yeah.
So we've talked about that in the podcast, which if you haven't listened to any Dave Mitton and mine conversations when it comes to my podcast, the very first one was epic. Second one was really good too, but you were one of the very first Canadian bartenders I knew before even coming to Canada because of Opening Soon. It is crazy. And then I'm pretty sure I've told you the story, but the very first time I met you face to face, I was a bit of fanboy, mainly because of Opening Soon. And I'm still, even now, I'm still the Australian kid who moved to Canada and was lucky enough to like become best friends with like epic industry people that in Australia I was like fanboying over. Was the very first time I came to Toronto. I was doing Cityline TV the morning after, and Kevin Brush, brought me into the Harvard room. And it was like our third or fourth stop already that night. And I remember having a drink. I think I had a lavender sidecar. Or lavender white lady. Lavender sidecar.
So that's 2007 you're talking.
Oh yeah. It was a while ago. And I remember you've hung out with KB plenty of times. Like, you know how I can slide really quickly. And I remember walking outside your place till my wife called because she was going to bed and I was still up. And she was like, Shawn Soole, if you are fucking hungover for Cityline tomorrow morning and you waste all this money and all this time traveling to Toronto and you fuck this up, I'm going to have your head. And I was like, yes, dear. And I went inside. I said goodbye to KB. I said goodbye to you. And I went back to my hotel room to get a good night's sleep because KB had already taken me out the night before and I was super hungover from that one as well. But that was my big experience. I remember coming into Harvard room. I think, it was 2007, 2008, and you were behind the bar, had a great cocktail. But my wife called me and she's like, don't you do this to us. You're going on national TV tomorrow live. Don't let KB be the bad influence. And she sent me home. And I literally jumped in the cab and went straight back to my hotel room.
It's remarkable how many people have a very similar story to how I got them in trouble from them sitting in that little pink room at my bar.
Well, man, for the first sort of run, I know we had technical difficulties in the front. This was by far spectacular. I know that we're doing a lot of stuff online and virtually right now, but this was fantastic. A lot of people commented. Everybody was jumping on board and stuff like this. Thank you so much. I appreciate absolutely everything you do. I've revered you as one of my peers and mentors for so many years. It's I don't think I say this enough sometimes and give people enough credit. You've influenced my life and my career so much over the last 20-something years. I really appreciate it. And having the opportunity to taste stuff that you haven't tasted at the same time, which is just I used to always assume, how long can you talk? Donnie's jumped on. Is Donnie in your apartment right now?
I mean, I don't know. He could be. It's Wheeler. Who knows? He could have snuck in somewhere. I just wouldn't know it. He might be. The windows on this side. Maybe he's staring at me from outside.
I'm going to get Donnie on. I'm going to do a big rum episode with Donnie, and then he's going to throw me a
great idea. Really
crazy rums that I got to try and track my ass down to find. But But honestly, man, thank you so much. I really didn't expect you to have not tasted some of the stuff we tasted tonight, and then having the opportunity to like taste this with you is like that little corner booth at like Toronto Cocktail Conference where like you just go, hey, I got this. Do you want to try it? And we sit down, we crack it, and we taste it right there and then. So this was epic. I really appreciate your time. I thank you so much. I know it's late on your side of the country, but thank you for being the very first Post Shift Podcast Happy Hour member.
Well, thank you. I mean, thank you for your kind words always. Thank you for having me. I just figured you're sick of having me on at this point, but it was an honor to be the first happy hour guest, and I'm glad we were able to make some fun whiskeys happen. And dude, I love hanging out with you anytime. Well, it doesn't have to be on a podcast. You can just call me too if you want.
I know. I've got to get more in that habit of just making phone calls and dropping texts. But thank you so much, man. I really appreciate it. Have a good weekend. I'll chat to you really soon, man.
You too. Thank you very much.